And I am the host of the Impact Exchange at Ankara, and I am very, very lucky to have a very special and in-demand guest today, and Kate Kalutkiewicz. Kate, can you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me, John. My name is Kate Kalutkiewicz. I lead the trade practice at McLarty Associates, one of Ankara's companies. We're a global consulting firm helping businesses try to make sense of what's happening in DC and also around the world, and notably on trade policy. I was a U.S. trade negotiator for the majority of my career, but concluded my time in the U.S. government in the first Trump White House, where I served as his special assistant on trade and investment.
So you've done some stuff. What did you do after that? Please tell me more.
When I left the Trump White House, I mean, how could I go anywhere but up? I went to Amazon, actually, where I led trade policy there for 3 years. During
So
COVID,
you were like a little retail distribution company.
Might have
called
heard
Amazon.
of this. Yeah.
And then somehow we convinced you to come. It probably came from Mac, who does a very good job of convincing people.
You know, I had been in the DC sphere for long enough to know who McLarty Associates was, and it was a dream job of mine. So to be able to come and lead the trade practice was a no-brainer decision.
Well, you're a dream guest of mine because it turns out people are talking about this tariff thing a lot. And I have stolen a ton from you, as I have shared, from your memos, especially some of your general memos on these are the facts and they're not going to change. A lot of other things are going to change, but there's some facts that won't. So before we get into those things, what is the big story around tariffs? Why are we focused on this, and why is it an issue that matters?
Well, you know, our president likes to call himself the tariff man. He's a huge fan of them. And he's put in a ton of them. Obviously, he's been in office for 100 days, and these are 100 days that are very different from the last time when I worked in the White House. He hit the ground running. He moved and put tariffs in place across the world for a lot of reasons. And with our clients, you know, generally I like to help them think about why. Why is he doing this? What are the motivations? Because then it helps you understand which are likely to stay in place and which are there for negotiation purposes. You know, first and foremost, the president talks about the need for tariffs to bring revenue into this country. He wants to bring down the deficit, and he thinks the tariffs, irrespective of who pays them, are going to do that. So one of the new tariffs he's put in place, a 10% increase on the entire world, is likely to remain in place. The United States had very low tariff rates on average, around 2.5%. This 10% has bumped us up to 12.5%. And I think politically, both Republicans and Democrats are okay with this. So it's here to stay. We have tariffs in place for fentanyl. You've heard about the fentanyl tariffs and the illegal immigration tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China. Those are very specifically there for negotiation. And, you know, I think once the president feels satisfied on what those nations are doing on fentanyl, he'll be prepared to bring those down. Then there's the basket that's intended to reset our trade relationship with the entire world. These are these reciprocal tariffs. He talks about them as fairness tariffs. He put those in place at different rates for almost every country in the world, and then paused them.
Even some that don't have populations.
That's right. That's right. Some obscure islands in the Pacific, right? In Madagascar, I think.
Let's get the penguins.
Well, you know, he paused those. And the idea here, of course, is to really bring countries to the table to give us some wins. The United States has already announced one negotiation with the UK, which has yielded at least a framework. And they are actively negotiating with a number of other countries. And then finally, we have a whole bunch of tariffs on critical sectors. And these are the sectors that President Trump really wants to see come back to the United States. These are areas like autos and steel and aluminum and pharmaceuticals and semiconductors. There are probably about a dozen or so of these types of investigations. And these tariffs are really probably going to hang around for the most part because they want to use them as a rationale for making it more competitive in the U.S.
All right. So I have, I spend a lot of time in the automotive industry, consulting a lot of big names. And the thing that I'm concerned about there, and I want to unpack all of this with you in a 15 to 20 minute podcast, is that it takes 2.5 to 3 years to build a factory minimum, especially if we're looking at high-tech manufacturing and automotive. The thing that worries me is in a lean supply chain with just in time where the muffler shows up right before it goes on the car and we have disruption. What happens in Detroit when the parts don't come across the border effectively from Canada? Are we worried about that, or do we have enough time to make adjustments to make this work?
I think those are exactly the right questions. And I think the auto sector is probably a really important one to kind of zoom in on. You know, the president has made no surprise or secret of his long-term goal, which is to somehow relocalize the entire auto supply chain in the United States. Now, we've spent years and decades building a North American supply chain, of course, and for the United States to be competitive, you know, vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis the EU, it's clear that Mexico and Canada are really important components there. So the president came out of the gate, as he often does, with the most extreme version of the tariffs, and then immediately pulled them back for Mexico and Canada.
Didn't he negotiate, though, the first one in his first term?
Well,
you were there. You were there.
Right. It was the greatest trade deal ever negotiated. The president says it all the time.
Yeah.
But on autos in particular, he has made some carve-outs, which are important. And they are exactly to your point, which is without North America, without an on-ramp, frankly, to rebuild supply chains, you can't yank this out overnight. We're going to be in real trouble. So he has put in place some important carve-outs for the auto sector, for Mexico and Canada, that I think indicate he's willing to listen to reason there.
So one thing that's interesting for me is when you look at a presidential term, we'll say he has 3.5 years left, let's say. If that's about how long it takes to build out the infrastructure to do this, and then we have a completely different president in the next term, or we have a third term for Trump, depending, whatever. But let's say we have a completely different president and everything gets reversed. Now we've built an infrastructure that we don't need unless, listen, there's high tech ways that we minimize labor in these environments, right? So that we can still do it and labor cost or 1-2% of the finished product. But it is highly disruptive to make a, $20 billion investment that then you never needed to make if you just held on for dear life. Yeah. So I worry about that.
No, and you're not the only one. I mean, I think it's a fair worry, particularly when most of these things are happening by executive action, right? I mean, the next president, you're right, could come in and switch things back. I think on this, though, I see continuity no matter what, right? We had the major shift on trade really started the first time Trump was in office, right? We had this huge shift in the way we approach these things. And then we saw President Biden make very few changes. Now we have Trump again. I think his likely successors, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, they're going to continue this sort of policy. And if we have a first-term Democrat president as well, I mean, I really don't think any of those people are going to move away from an agenda which incentivizes new investments in the United States. Now, it would be better if Congress would do what it's supposed to do and actually pass legislation to make this durable. But I actually think there's little risk that we're going to have a wide shift no matter who wins the next presidential.
So what's interesting about what you're saying to me, and all of this, by the way, I obsess about everything you write. Honestly, I read all of it. So what's interesting for me is a couple things. One is we often appreciate the outcome of Trump's chaos. So right. The chaotic speed and rules and lack of rules, the output is appreciated by a broader group of people. And I've had people from the Biden White House. I've sat down with them to talk about the situation, and they said, frankly, we appreciate all the cost cutting. We didn't have the political power to do it, and there's a lot of waste, and we're glad he's getting rid of it. It's a long time coming. But the outcome, I think, might be very durable, because if he has the blood on his hands of how it got done, and then we all agree that this is working, why would we ever reverse this? It would be anti-American. So do you want to reflect on that for a second?
I mean, sure. Well, obviously, I agree with you. I mean, I think we have seen even in just regular Americans, this notion, they respond to what President Trump talks about when he says, we've given so much to the rest of the world and we haven't gotten the same in return. And, right before the election, even the public support for tariffs, as a former trade negotiator who used to bring tariffs down, was shockingly high. And so, I do think it's durable. I do think, I'm glad you mentioned the Biden administration talking about the wins that he's producing. We hear this from our trading partners as well, sometimes begrudgingly, right? But, the outcomes here are not just benefiting him and his supporters. They're frankly for the entire country and in some cases the world.
So recently I had on as a guest Bret Stephens from the New York Times. Everybody said they're going to cancel their subscriptions because Bret Stephens is a terrible human, but it's whatever. He's an old friend of mine and he's an old classmate of mine. And he makes this, and I promise you I'm going somewhere with this. He makes this argument that the population of the world is overwhelmingly intellectually lazy. And the problem with that issue is we never go past the headlines. And so when I'm very curious about things that are not in the press right now because the press isn't feeding me the details that I want. What I'm curious about, and I'm hoping you can guide me through this, is we keep on talking about all the other countries that have tariffs against the United States. But it's not just tariffs, it's also subsidies and other things that make unfair trade practices. If we can take a chunk of time to talk about, we don't have to, some specifics are fine, but I want to know, like, what are they actually doing to us? Can you explain the architecture of what the threat is and the unfair fight that we're in?
I'm glad you asked that question. It's a great question. And it is one that you wouldn't really know unless you dug into it. And agriculture is a great example of this generally, which, the U.S., everybody thinks U.S. is the powerhouse in agriculture. And we are, by and large. We sell a lot of our farm goods to the entire world. The one place where that is shrinking increasingly is Europe. And there's no real answer for that except for European regulation, which, goes a different way than us and inconsistently. We do have world trade rules in which we can challenge regulations which are not based on science or risk assessment, the way that we come up with regulatory protections in the United States. Over and over, we've won litigation against the European Union on unfair bans on our chicken, on our beef, on our pork, on our corn. I mean, the list goes on. And so the European Union, of course, can have a 0% tariff, but if they have these barriers in place, we can't sell. So that's one example. Another, I think, important and timely one is pharmaceuticals. You saw the president issue a pharmaceutical executive action this week that really looked at the domestic market, right? It looked at how do pharmaceutical companies charge in the United States. But really important provision in that EO is around something the president calls freeloading. This is the kind of language he uses, but reflects the fact that
the technical term
freeloading. But it reflects the fact that countries like Germany, countries like Korea, these are not third world countries. They are negotiating and forcing U.S. companies to pay much, much lower rates, which is not consistent with the level of innovation or treatment, but they're blackmailing them, essentially compelling then the U.S. companies to recoup investments in the United States at the cost of significantly higher drug prices. So, it would be pretty incredible if the president could get other countries, particularly those at equal income levels, to bear their fair share of the burden here too. These are drugs that are often developed because of research in the United States and benefit their economies. So I think this is another example of the president seeking reduction in things that are not tariff related to ensure fair treatment.
So and the subsidy issue for me is interesting. Yeah. When we look at like Canadian forestry or anything in any country, and I always, again, it's that's not a headline. It's here are the 15 reasons why it's unfair.
Yeah.
And that's what I struggle with. Is there a place where people go to actually look? I mean, you've really got to dig.
Yeah. I mean, subsidies are really challenging because in some ways we've decided as a bunch of countries deciding what's fair and what's not, or that subsidies by themselves are not the problem so long as, let's say we give a subsidy to a company to build a new facility, right? So we say, okay, well, we're going to give you a little extra help if you come build it in my community. That is legal so long as a European company can compete for that subsidy too, or a Japanese company, right?
So IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act.
IRA, good one. Yeah, exactly. So subsidies are completely fine if you let everybody compete for them. The problem becomes when they are protective subsidies like lumber, like everything the Chinese do to promote, their new production in chips, in semiconductors, in quantum computing, and the rest of it. Because what it does is create sort of an unfair equilibrium in a market system. And these are the sorts of trading rules we try to go after, because in a system that preferences domestic champions, you completely upset fair competition. And this, I think, this goes to some of the tariffs the president is looking for, particularly in critical manufacturing. Lumber is there, by the way. That's under investigation as well.
Yeah, I saw the map of Canadian lumber, and I was like, oh, this is big. So
we don't always have clean hands ourselves. I'll be very, very fair about that.
How dare you, Kate Kalutkiewicz? No, totally. I understand we do have our own games we play, but
not nearly as bad though.
Can you explain to me, as a person who was in charge of articulating much of this stuff for much of your career, is there a reason? Is it that we just don't think the public can digest the facts? Or is it that the facts are too complicated? Or is it just easier to say these are bad, these people are cheating?
Well, I mean, obviously it's a very diverse set of facts, and the regular person probably doesn't have the interest in sorting this out. They're too busy worried about providing
everything else.
Yeah. I mean, look, and I think this is the issue on tariffs generally, which is, Americans, I will say, there wasn't a huge focus on trade for so long. And then Trump came in the first time and said, we've been hollowed out. This has been a net loser for us. All our companies are moving overseas and taking their workers with them. We had the recession in 2008. People started to respond to that because they were seeing it. And then COVID hit, right? And then the American public in particular finally realized that a lot of our supply chains are, spread out around the world, sometimes, in control of countries that don't care so much about us. And prices went up and people started to mistrust the big multinationals, felt they were taking advantage of it. And then we had, the labor union strikes and the highest support for labor unions in this country since Kennedy. So the entire dynamic has shifted. And I think Americans are starting really to say, yeah, you know what? This was a failed experiment. I think that we should have more manufacturing. We should have more mining, and you and I can sit here and think, do Americans really want those jobs? Because the whisper, the thing that is whispered and not shouted, is we might not have enough workers to do all of what President Trump wants to do. And so that's going to be, I think, something that plays out in the near term.
I like that now it's you interviewing me, by the way, as the head labor expert at Anchor.
I would like
to answer all of your questions. So it is interesting, the labor side of it, and the drive for innovation and automation is something that happens when things become so scarce or so expensive. And when you look at the price of labor on a fully built luxury car, it's about 3 or 4%. Yeah. And that's fascinating when we're fighting all of these UAW contracts and all of these things are happening. We may lose, 0.5% of, the total cost of the car. But, I know we don't really know where it's all going to go. But in conclusion, to think with you, meaning I just listen and you tell me how it's all going to turn out, what happens to turbulence and what should CEO, CFO, COO, CHROs, the executive leadership team, what should they be worried about for the next 3.5 years?
I'm going to spin it, right? I'm going to first say what I've been saying for the last year, even before we knew the outcome of the election.
This is your media training where you do the double reversal on
me. It's me being a glass half full person. I'll agree. There's turbulence is staying, right? Okay. Yes. But what I try to help people think about is prepare, don't panic. Everyone's heard me say it. I'm now becoming a broken record, yes. But it's true. We know who he is. We know that the unpredictability is part of this game. This is not, an accident. So waiting for the when is, not the right strategy here, right? Like how to be proactive, how to think about the tools in a company toolbox. They're your workers, they're your customers, they're your suppliers, they're the whole part of your supply chain, your representatives in Congress. I mean, there are any number of people or, in an ecosystem that can be part of your team. How do you be proactive? How do you try to find opportunities? And there are many opportunities, right? How do you mitigate the risks? So there is a way, I think, to be proactive in this space. It's challenging. I know all companies would prefer to know exactly what's going to happen. Many companies say we can take 145% tariffs on China if you tell us that's what it's going to be. We'll figure it out. The problem is when they're on and then they're off and then they're on and then they're off. But that's this president. And I think the one thing that's probably important to focus on, we worry about 3.5 years, of course, but the reality is the midterm elections are critical to his ability to continue to govern. So
I didn't think about this. That's a very good point.
Yeah. And I think what we have seen, he went out very, very strong on tariffs and he's been forced to come back. And yes, that pullback is not because he's feeling kind to China, right? Or feels differently about his objectives, but the domestic circumstances are changing. And the people in his party that have to run for reelection, that have voters that remembered that President Trump said he was going to bring prices down, let's not forget, have started to pressure the White House to take a more nuanced approach. And so if the midterm elections result in Democrat control of one house, we have a very different last 2 years than we could if he retains control. And so that will start to play very heavily, I think, on his mind.
So I think this has been both reassuring and terrifying for me. Thank you. I will call my therapist and say, I'm having a really rough day and I think things are going to work out.
I love that. I'm going to steal that from you.
Very good. Well, I've stolen everything else from you. And I really appreciate you sharing your experience. I really don't think there's anybody, when you look at the holistic story of tariffs and trade, that knows more than you do in the world.
Oh, thanks, John.
No, I mean, people need to read more of your stuff. They need to read more of it. They need to listen to what you're saying because it's not, hysterical panic. It's let's be rational, use the data and understand how it impacts our businesses and our decision-making. Maybe we need 2 more warehouses than we have. Maybe we need a little bit more inventory. And by the way, that's going to create better customer service and maybe a slight increase in prices, but we will be able to take better care of our workforce when they don't have to go up and down freaking out over demand changes, right? Which happen anyway. So I think the moral of the story is listen to Kate. That's how she's making an impact. Well, thank you for giving me your time too. I really appreciate it.